Today, we welcome yet another VIP guest onto the show to ask what's gone wrong with our country, why, and how can we put it right, or is it all too late? Today's guest is Joseph Robertson, the Strategic Director of Touchpoint Strategy, who has advised many politicians and senior figures over the years. Joseph has appeared regularly on TV and has a background in political journalism and strategy for various think tanks. And Touchpoint hosted the Great Immigration Debate earlier this year and worked with a wide range of political and commercial clients on the centre-right of politics. Joseph, welcome to the show. Lovely to have you on. Thank you. First of all, can you explain to my viewers in layman's terms, what is a political strategic director and advisor? What does he do?
Well, the director bit comes from my company. I'm a director at Touchpoint Strategy. It's a public affairs, digital comms company. But the political strategy is something I've been doing for a number of years, advising high-level politicians, people in the media on policy, on what they should be saying when they go on television, as an example, what you should be saying when you're creating a new policy document or you're going on the campaign trail. What we think that people need to hear and what politicians should be doing. And of course, there's a little bit of spin involved in that, but actually my job is pretty much trying to keep politicians honest most of the time.
So you've never worked with Keir Starmer, I take it?
I haven't. I'm sure I could do something even with him if I tried hard enough, but it might take.
What do you make of his performance so far as a politician? And what would your advice to him be at the moment? Because he's got to be. He's so unpopular.
He's unpopular as a leader, but I think what he did very well is he kept quiet. And that was the best advice that his advisors could give him, because the Tories were in self-destruct mode for a long time. What he's running into now is the problem you get when you get into government, which is that if you haven't already done it, you don't really know what you're doing, and it's all about what you've inherited. So Labour can come in with all of their grand socialist ideas and they can try and enact policy and they will get plenty done. But the reality is there's not a lot of money for them to work with. There's not a lot of groundwork there for them. So you get into government and you think, day one, you can implement everything you've ever wanted to do. You can be a mini dictator, which I believe is what Starmer thinks he can be. And you realise that you're not just up against the civil service, but you're up against the banks, you're up against the machinery of how this world operates. And unless you've been in government for a good few years, it's hard to get to grips with that straight away. And that's why he's doing so badly, as well as being ideologically bankrupt. But that's a whole other conversation.
What would you say, obviously you've watched him closely. What's been his defining moment so far, do you think? What's the biggest mistake that he's made?
I think the only mistake he made on the campaign trail was when he gave away his plans to get closer to Europe again. I actually thought he spoke quite well on immigration for what he is and for what he believes. He actually kept the rhetoric going that he was going to smash the gangs and stop the boats. Now, you can examine those policies and they don't have a lot of depth to them. But his rhetoric wasn't too bad. The only real mistake he made was talking about drawing closer to the EU. And in this sort of post-Brexit silo that we live in, I think a lot of people got put off by that. Not enough to stop him winning. But I think a lot of the voter apathy we saw during the election, we didn't see a huge number of people getting out to vote for Labour. In fact, they lost their vote share. They decreased. It was just the fact so many people didn't vote or went to the Lib Dems or Reform that they got in. So I don't think he's had a defining moment as a PM yet. I think he's made a couple of silly sort of errors here and there, but they haven't been major. The problem is that his cabinet has got a collective IQ probably equal to his, and he's struggling to get anything done.
Talking about reform, I don't know if you can tell us the names of any of the politicians you've worked with in the past. Are you able to do that?
I can talk about some. I mean, I've been close with everybody you can think of on the centre right in this country, and then in Europe, I've worked with a couple of different parties over there doing quite well now. So,
whilst Europe seems to have moved to the right, we appear to have almost by stealth moved to the left.
Yeah, I don't know that the old left-right paradigm really works anymore, because a lot of what we're talking about is common sense politics. It's sort of the politics of the people. And I think what's really happening is you've got this kind of class struggle going on where your people who are in the working classes, in the agricultural classes, in the society that gets things done is rebelling against this kind of new elite that we've got forming. And the problem with this elite is that while they have all these plans to lord it over us in a globalist kind of paradigm, they don't have a lot of real world experience. So when things like immigration start to hit the man on the street, they don't know how to respond to that necessarily. And we can talk all day about whether or not things are planned, or whether or not there's a sort of an elite subversion going on at the very top of politics. But that doesn't really matter, because the reality is that your common man, your everyday man, the guy who goes out and votes for reform, or the AfD in Germany, or the National Rally in France, they're not really thinking about government. They're actually thinking about what they're seeing happening around them in their communities. And these politicians have no real way of relating to that. Reform does a little bit more, because a lot of the people in it aren't career politicians. It's not really about them being right or left wing. I mean, you're going to see a lot of Labour voters voting Reform next time round. And particularly, for instance, in the Netherlands, you saw a Farmers' Party, which wasn't made up of left or right. It was just an agricultural vehicle, which ended up allowing Geert Wilders to win over there. So a lot of this is more about sort of a class struggle, I would say.
What do you make of some of the criticism that Nigel's been in for recently? He appears to have moved more to the centre, if you like, rather than to the right. A lot of people are saying, come on, Nigel, tell us what we want to hear. I mean, Robert Jenrick has kind of been out Faraging Farage.
Yeah, I mean, what I would say with this is people right now are quite they're keen for leadership. They're in the middle of an existential crisis in many ways. It's only just reaching Britain. It's been around in Europe for a lot longer. But the way that people respond to the demographic crisis and the cultural crisis is slightly more measured in this country than it has been in Europe. We don't have riots. We don't normally, until recently, we don't have that kind of thing in this country. We don't have a very explosive population. And so what people want now from Nigel, as an example, or for any of what we would call those centre-right politicians, they want to hear baying for blood. They want to hear rhetoric that really puts their opinions on the map. They want to hear about the Great Replacement. They want to hear about plans to deport, a million illegal migrants. What Nigel is doing is not necessarily moving to the centre policy-wise. I think his policy is pretty strong. And can be developed further. I think what he's doing is being overly pragmatic. So this is the problem for a lot of people. They want to hear Nigel come out and say, I'll deport everybody on day one. But looking at that with my policy brain on, and giving Nigel a fair rub, I know that that's not achievable. Jenrick can say he'll do that, but the reality is it costs a lot of money to move 1 million people from one country to another. And a hell of a lot of infrastructure that we just don't have in place. I mean, there's so many things to change before you get to that point. For instance, leaving the ECHR, leaving the UN Convention. And there's also other things to think about that a lot of people haven't really grasped yet. And I think this is probably Nigel included, because he hasn't spent time in Number 10 looking at all of the issues. So as an example, I'll give you one example. A lot of the border security in Dover, a lot of the hotels which migrants are being shipped to, and the logistics route is all run by a group called Serco, which is a private contractor. Now, to get rid of Serco and replace them with either the army or a new private contractor is obviously going to be one of the jobs on day one of government. It's the little stepping stones, the boring things that need to be done on day one, that I think Nigel and probably some of the policy heads around him are thinking about. And that's sort of moving towards a less fiery kind of rhetoric. Now, I don't fully think that that's a good strategy for him. I think he needs to keep hammering on the rhetoric. If I was advising him on what to say, I would say to listen to what people are. Their number one topic right now is immigration. Across the country, it doesn't matter who you vote for. It's what people want to see, and obviously deporting illegal migrants should be a simple act of government to begin with. The only thing I'd say in his defense is that this costs a lot of money that we don't have. and it also requires a hell of a lot of different loopholes to be jumped through before you get to that point. So the rhetoric could be better, but the policy is fine.
I'm trying to work out at the moment who's more dangerous to whom. Is generic more of a danger to reform, or is reform more of a danger to the Conservative Party?
We've got to stop looking at it as Tory versus Reform. It's not Tory versus Reform anymore. Reform has solidified their place. They got over 4 million votes, which is more than the Lib Dems. The Lib Dems have been around for years doing damage. They've even managed to get into a coalition government at some point. Reform came along and swept all of that away. Now, did they take a large proportion of the Tory membership? Yeah, sure. I think a lot of people left. A lot of people also exited the Tory membership to the Lib Dems. So it's not a cut and dried kind of case where it's Generic versus Farage. Really, Nigel's target is the red wall. Generic's never going to win in the northern seats because of the way they feel about how they were treated when they lent the Tories their vote in 2019. So that's free territory for Nigel, as is the East Coast, Anglia, the seaside towns. None of these places traditionally vote Conservative, except, Clacton did for a bit, but also was UKIP before. These are the outsiders. These are the places that get forgotten. And neither Labour nor the Tories appeal to that. So Generic won't recover these places just by rhetoric. It's going to take another 5-10 years of building up trust again in the Tory brand. In fact, in some ways, the Tory brand is probably hindering Generic rather than the other way around. So I don't think Generic's a threat to Nigel necessarily. I think his plan is to recover voters from Reform and the Lib Dems. So he's looking at a dual kind of strategy to get them back into the party. But the Tories have accepted that they don't have a right to exist. Not all of them, of course. A few are gonna claim that, but they don't have a right to exist. I think what Reform have got to get into their heads is that they don't have a right to exist either. And they can quite easily disappear in the way that they came up on the scene. So it's all about getting that balance for them as well. I think we're in a 4-party system. That's probably the best way to say it.
The big questions I want to ask you really is, what's gone wrong with this country and why?
Well, there's a 2-word answer to a lot of that, and that's Tony Blair. So a lot of this institutional change, a lot of this demographic shift happened under that Labour government that started in 97. 97 signalled a political revolt. It signalled a new style of politics where Blair was one of the first people in this country to properly mix populism into what he was doing. He wasn't talking just about policy. He was trying to get people on side through being the guy that everybody liked. And when he got in, because of that landslide, he was able to enact change that this country has never seen on a constitutional level. One of the biggest examples of this is that, for instance, the law lords got taken out and replaced with the Supreme Court in this country. A lot of power was given to not just the House of Lords, but also direct royal assent was important. So this country is obviously a constitutional monarchy, and a lot of people underestimate the power of a constitutional monarchy to make sure that things stay relatively balanced. Because once you get royal assent, the government is given the signal that they can pass that act, and then there's no other kind of contest to that. So you don't have political infighting once it's happened, it's done. If you want to change that legislation in the future, you have to get that royal assent again. But we saw probably the first time very clearly that the Supreme Court, which was only founded 15 years ago, was able to overturn royal assent. And this happened under Boris Johnson when he tried to prorogue Parliament to get the Brexit debate through. And he got royal assent, Parliament was prorogued, and the Supreme Court overturned that ruling. And that's just a symptom of what Blair did. It's this ability for the state, for the blob, for the civil service to overturn the way things should run in this country. It's very subversive, and it wasn't just the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court's one example, but also the way that we adhere to certain treaties over immigration, moving closer to European policy, an expanded and bloated civil service, stacking the House of Lords with cronies. All of these are things that Blair did. So how do we get to the point where it's got even worse? Because under Blair, Blair started mass migration. He opened the doors, but he didn't complete the project. Ironically, that was David Cameron. And I think what happened under Blair is that the Tories realised they didn't have to be too far away from what Labour were doing. In some ways, Blair was the original master of creating a uniparty, because he didn't make anything too extreme. The constitutional stuff he was doing was very, very revolutionary. It was on a similar scale to what happened in the revolutions in the continent. It was soft communism coming in many ways. It was the backdoor for republicanism. It was a backdoor to eventually get rid of the monarchy. This is all really serious stuff for a country that's survived on the basis of monarchy for thousands of years. And no one really saw that, because he did it all with a smile, and he did it all with a big cuddly sort of overture to the people. And so Mr. Cameron and others of his ilk, who are called sort of liberal wet conservatives, they saw this style of politics and thought, we'll have some of that. So they came along and they emulated Blair in many ways. They were saying things that were quite Blair-esque. Maybe not all of their policies, but certainly the way they conveyed them, the way they worked with the civil service, the way they stacked the lords with their own mates. All of this stuff kind of stems from Blair. And to be fair, John Major was already beginning to do that even before Blair, but Blair really put the final nail in the coffin. So people kind of respected Blair, and so they wanted to become like him, and that's what Cameron did. You know, in some ways, he said that he was the heir to Blair, and people didn't believe him, but boy, was he. And then it was one thing after another. Constitutional reform is so key in all of this. We had the vote on gay marriage in this country, which on the surface of it seems like a social issue, maybe a liberal issue. But again, we're changing definitions. So the definition of the word marriage, which is the root of that word, is motherhood. So it's quite difficult to overlook that as a massive constitutional moment. We started rewriting not just politics, not just constitution, but the way we use language in this country. And suddenly everything was up for grabs. Everything became subjective. Everything started to fall apart. And the people who had that agenda of what I would call taking over this country, allowing migration to become the route to regeneration in this country, rather than encouraging native birth populations.
Yeah,
they were allowed power. They in all of this chaos that was created. So I think liberalism and subjectivity are the two words for people to think about here. Subjectivism has killed this country. We've been subjective for so long. We're only starting to wake up again after 25, 30 years of this. That actually there are some truths that this country was built on, and they're really important.
So moving forward, looking at the scene politically now, how do we move forward? Can we save the country, or do you think it's too late? And when we look at the damage that's been done.
Yeah, I'm pessimistic in some ways. I'm pessimistic particularly on a cultural level, and particularly when you look at urban areas. So London, as an example, is very far gone. It's difficult to reclaim it. There are too many structures in place, particularly on the mayoral level.
When you say reclaim it, in which way do you mean reclaim it?
I mean, reclaiming London as an example, but every city from what I call this new elite that I mentioned, that I referenced earlier. These people who have a very radically different view of the world than, let's say, a farmer in Shropshire or a farmer in Yorkshire. They don't think the way that the British do. They're actually quite megalomaniac. They think about things through their own lens. They want to be despots of a kind. They quite like the idea of running everything without ever consulting the people first. And of course, that's not the way this country works. We've got an air of fairness, of transparency, of truth that we've always had throughout the years.
Yeah.
And these people don't think of that. They think of gathering in their clubs, whether it's Sadiq Khan going off to his mayoral summit that they have every year with a group of mayors around the world who decide what's best for cities on sustainability and urban planning and all the other good things that Sadiq Khan does, or whether it's Keir Starmer who prefers Davos to Westminster. These London-centric kind of thinkers, if you want to call them that, I wouldn't say they think very much. They're planning on replacing our populations They're planning on destroying our families, and they're planning on taking away our means of survival so that they can continue this onslaught of constitutional change. In a way, all of this, the best example of this is to look at China and look at what happened in the revolution over there, because all of this is happening here now. This system of social control, this creation of a middle class that kind of rules everything, and then this huge drop away to people who basically can't do anything except rent and keep food on the table. And so we're seeing a very sinister kind of movement towards soft communism here. I wouldn't even call it soft anymore, particularly on the free speech issues. It's beginning to get more obvious of what they're doing. So when I say reclaiming London, I'm talking about reclaiming it from that mob, that demographic. And it's tricky to do in London because they've worked the game of immigration very well in the capital city. Most people who are brought into this country end up voting Labour because Labour were the open door to this country. So I think there's a kind of psychological thing at play here. People don't see the Tories as welcoming on immigration, even though they were the ones who excavated the numbers. So you're always going to get this sort of soft left vote from the minority base in London, which is quite tricky to overcome. But I think there is hope, and I would say that one of the biggest things on this is if you look at the combined polling between the Tories and Reform right now, they're way above 40%. They are smashing Labour in the polls, and they were even before the election, it has to be said. The problem is unity. Our real problem is unity, right? And one thing I always say, much as I talk about policy and I talk about, the intricacies of the way things work, the most important thing is to have a really, really identifiable, relatable leader who can bring this all together. Because very often it doesn't really matter what somebody says, and it doesn't really matter if they mean it. People like somebody who takes the lead. We saw this with Boris. We saw this with Blair. We've seen this every time there's a charismatic leader, and Nigel to an extent. People are willing to overlook policy because of the man. And right now we're missing talent. We're missing a huge amount of talent. You might not have agreed with everything that Thatcher did as an example, but everywhere you look, there was talent. There was talent in her policy unit, on the front bench, behind her, in her ear, left, right, centre, and on the opposition bench. There was talent everywhere. You might not agree with what they were saying, but the way they said it was a way that you wanted to hear. It was a way you wanted to listen. And it's a very difficult thing to overcome when you've let things slide. I go back to this thing on subjectivity. It eats away at people's character. They don't know what to stand for anymore, so they become a lot more bland, and they're not as willing to be a fiery politician in the way that someone like Mrs. Thatcher was.
Who is your man right now? I mean, do you think that Farage is the guy that can ultimately get us back on a sensible level?
Well, if I'm going to answer my own question on talent. I mean, Farage is the only political talent in the pool right now. There's nobody else. And when I talk about talent, the baseline for that is charisma, is the ability to convey the message in a clear way that people understand. And then the third part of that is relatability. And he passes all three of those tests. There's no one else who does that. Can you imagine Starmer? I mean, Starmer quite literally got kicked out of somebody's pub a few months ago. Nigel's the only one who could go in and have a pint. And that's a really important part to consider. Genric's not bad. He's not bad, but he's not a statesman. He's not a statesman. I mean, Cami, if she gets in, then it's even worse for them because she can't hold a conversation. So your only hope on what I would call the centre right of politics is Nigel Farage, and he is the best we have to offer in this country. And he's like Marmite to many people. He rubs plenty of people up the wrong way, but he says it how it is, and even his worst enemy would sit down for a beer with him. I think that's a very important thing to consider.
Yeah, what do you make of just recently we've seen this issue with the migrant, making threats, etc. The mainstream media seem to have almost ignored that. I mean, they really have decided that Nigel's the bad guy.
So many things. I mean, I used to be a journalist, and more astounding than the stories that get published are the stories that aren't. And the thing you've got to understand is that no journalist that every journalist has some sort of agenda, but no journalist has the time or the luxury of time to really sit down and plot about what they're going to put out in the morning. They've got to rely on an editor that feeds them maybe 10 stories. It's divided out between the team. They go out that day, they hunt on the story, they get their quotes, and they produce their articles. Journalism in this country has become oversaturated. It's too quick. The media is too fast. It's all about content. So if there's a slightly controversial story, oh, could we get accused of being racist for putting this out? Could we receive backlash? Could we lose some subscribers over this? They just won't touch it. And it's not necessarily cowardice. It's partly cowardice for sure in some cases, and it's partly an agenda in others. But a lot of it is our own fault. It's overconsumption. People are far more interested in the fact that a member of One Direction died recently, right, than they are in the migrant who's threatening Nigel. So the editors weigh that up in the morning, and they end up going with whatever the easiest win is for the most number of clicks and views. We're all guilty of this, right? We're all guilty of it because we sensationalize things at times, and the media is the worst example of this. To do hard-hitting journalism is really boring sometimes. And it's about trying to make the issue bigger. It's about trying to bring it home. If that migrant was threatening women and children on the street, then it's a different story, and he will do eventually. That's the sad reality of it. We know that this guy is evil and needs kicking out of the country, but it's about how you raise that awareness. We've got to be really smart about making it interesting.
So talking about uniting, do you see that happening in the future with Reform and the Tories? I mean, look, as you said, if you put the Tory support and Reform support together, Labour are nowhere.
Sure.
How do we make that work?
We make it work out of necessity. So I think closer to the election, there'll be a conversation about this. I don't expect Reform to cave to a Tory offer. I think it will be very much on Reform's terms if it happens. But there's another thing I would say, which is that if all goes well and both parties continue to increase their vote share, you could see the Tories winning in certain heartlands where Reform don't have a foot, and you could see Reform winning in areas where the Tories have never really had a foot. So I'm talking about the Red Wall, Wales, Scotland, areas where traditionally the Tories haven't done that well. And Reform could take those seats. So if that happens, Labour may actually go extinct next time round, and you would have either a hung parliament or a very close contest where the Tories and Reform are forced to make a deal. And I think that's our best case scenario. That's what we've got to hope for next time round. There are other options to this. One option is that the Tory party under potentially Kemi goes so woke and so out of touch with the common person that the Tories really do flood out of their own party and they go to the Lib Dems and Reform. And then it's a one-way battle between Reform and Labour. You've got another scenario where Reform starts to slip up in policy and everyone goes back to the Tories and we get another 4 years of a Tory government. All three options are in play, and I'm not saying any one of them is the best option. But the important thing is Labour are not unstoppable. They don't have a good platform to run on. Yeah. They're going to do a lot of damage for about 3 years. But after that, we've got a real chance to get back into the game.
I think, as you say, there's everything to play for right now. My only fear for Nigel is I just don't feel personally that I don't feel he's been on the ball myself. I think he appears to have just moved more to the centre. I said it earlier, he's not ringing a lot of people's bell right now.
Well, I'll tell you why that is, Paul, and this is the reason why a lot of politicians, when they get into power, don't deliver. It's not just about empty promises, and it's not just about rhetoric. It's about the scale of the job when you actually get into that position. So Nigel, as an outsider, as an operator, as a guy who has always been calling out the establishment, has had the luxury of time for many, many years. He's every day been able to say what's on his mind to a camera and in private, and if he doesn't like it, he can take it down. Now he's in the spotlight, not just of the nation, not just of social media, but of his constituents, of all-party parliamentary groups of people who hold real power. This isn't media power. This isn't populism. This is the everyday workings of government. It's a totally different ballgame. And the number of MPs I know who have gone in as bright-eyed ideologues who have this vision of changing the world, and they come out 5-10 years later, and they're dry as anything. They're dry because every day they're bogged down with my potholes need fixing. You know, you don't understand quite how lonely and boring it can be as an MP. And to me, that's why a lot of them end up going off the rails and having scandals and doing drugs and all this kind of thing. It's because that place is very boring and very lonely at times.
Does he have the right people around him at the moment, do you think?
In Parliament, I don't think that Reform, and I don't have any problem with saying this, I don't think Reform's team will be the most experienced. They've got one or two very experienced operators working with them. But there's a big difference between good on ground game, campaigning, digital, all this kind of stuff. And they had good people around them in the election. And running an office in Parliament. Running an office in Parliament takes having run an office in Parliament. You need those staffers around you who know the game. The special advisors have been there and done it or studied politics. The boring people, the people who can get it done for you. Who aren't afraid to respond to a letter about your trees being cut down on the local railway line. It's a totally different ball game. And Nigel, I know Nigel doesn't have time because I've heard him say it. So when you go into that position, regardless of who you are, there's no time.
And what about bringing people into the fold? Who would you like to see reform? I mean, I'd like to see Suella Braverman move over. That would be, for me, that would be a good move for both parties.
Suella's great. She thinks in the same way that Reform do. You've got the likes of Matt Goodwin, who's sort of circulating in Reform now. Matt's an exceptional kind of charisma. He's got a lot of groundswell because he lays things out in a very methodical manner. Suella's the same kind of character. The problem with a lot of these people is that they are outside the tent right now. So Reform since the election to me have become very insular. They're not willing to take on outsiders, and there's a good reason for that, which is they're afraid of entryism. They're afraid of people coming into their party and trying to make it what they don't want it to be. So they have clamped down. They've cut off a lot of associations with people that others thought they should have associated with, both on the more left side of the spectrum and the right. And their reason for doing that is because they're trying to professionalize. They're trying to make sure nothing happens that could jeopardize them running next time around. But in doing that, you alienate a lot of people. And so it's this kind of lose-lose situation for a party that's got into power, because you've got to professionalize. You've got to make sure that everyone has the right pieces and that you don't get a scandal on day one. But at the same time, you've got to start letting people in, because ultimately that's where, it goes back to my point about talent. There are a lot of young, hungry, talented people out there, and they need to be given opportunities, not just to run for Parliament, but to speak about and on behalf of Reform in the media. As an example, I don't think Reform's media game is expanding. I think it's good, but I think they could do more working with independent contributors, channels, all this kind of thing. They need to be reaching out to people a lot more. So there's room for improvement, and it's just about getting to that point where they have the time to do it.
People like Ben Habib, for me, would be a great asset for Reform. Unfortunately, on the outside, they need to get people like Ben back in, for me.
Yeah, I'm seeing Ben very soon. He's a good friend. I think the problem with the way that the party structure works at the moment is that there is too much baggage that's been left from years and years of campaigning. I'm not going to go into the ins and outs of who I think is right in all of this, but one of the issues you've got is that when you've been around people for decades, naturally cracks are going to appear, friendships are going to end, there's going to be infighting, there's going to be problems that people don't even know about behind the scenes that leads to all of this. And it's setting that aside for the sake of the country. That's the important part now. We don't have time. We're running out of time.
We got to look at the bigger picture now, haven't we?
You've got to look at the bigger picture. But if you're a Tory, you have to do the same thing. I know I was talking to an MP on Monday who'll remain nameless, But they're working very closely with Reform. They're working, in some cases, even with Lib Dem MPs on free speech issues. I mean, now is not the time for party politics. Now is not the time for people to be wearing a badge and a colour. We're not in the era of football team politics anymore.
Yeah.
It's not about whether you support Spurs or Arsenal. It's about whether or not you want to see your country being saved. Labour, Tory, Reform, whoever it is, you've got to be a patriot right now. And if you're doing that, especially as a politician, it means you've got to work with people. Of course, we know that there are enemies. You don't want to let people into your party who are going to destroy it. And that's why I do believe in some sort of top-down structure in parties. It's important. It's not free for all, but it's getting that balance.
What does he do? What does Reform and Nigel, what do they do with the issue of the current membership ban? I mean, even people like myself, right now, I can't join Reform because I do not fit their criteria. How are they going to square that circle?
So I don't know about your own case, Paul, but what I would say is that to sign up for Reform membership, you just pay 25 quid and you're on. There's no vetting process for most members. There might be exceptional circumstances with certain people they don't like. We all know that that's happened. But there's no barrier to entry. I'd also say that in terms of their constitution, which they unveiled at conference, it's not that bad. It does give a certain amount of power to the members to depose their own leader. There are a lot of ways to show that you're unhappy if you're a Reform supporter. So I think they're democratizing pretty well. I think, there are obviously cases, and we can, mention, for instance, Tommy Robinson as an example of somebody Nigel's fallen out with in the past. That's his decision. It's a political decision. He doesn't think that it's right to be alongside Tommy at the moment. I don't know who's right in that scenario. I don't know why they fell out on a person.
Well, I don't think they've ever spoken. I don't think they've fallen out as such. I think to fall out, both parties have to have had a fallout. This is, for me, it's been...
But we're going back to a decade-long issue that stemmed from UKIP. Right, and none of this is simple. A lot of it is because they've been at it for so long. And Nigel, we forget, Nigel was run 9 times to get into Parliament. Yeah. This isn't like day one and there's this populist revolt and then Nigel comes out of nowhere and takes over, which is what's happening in Europe. It's all very fresh-faced. They haven't had the infighting days yet. I guarantee in 5-10 years' time, the AFD and the National Rally and all of these and Vox will have their own infighting because they'll have been around each other long enough
for a long time. Yeah,
it's like an old married couple, isn't it? In some ways.
Yeah. I mean, the reason I can't join Reform is when UKIP, when Gerard Batten left, there was a move to get Anne-Marie Waters in. She then set up her own party for Britain. I joined that, and as a member of For Britain, they say I can't join. But look, I'm willing to look past that. We're looking at the bigger picture. And I have been and will continue to support Reform.
Well, the Overton window shifts constantly. And by that, for viewers, the Overton window is the acceptable set of ideas that politicians allow, right? And the reason why it shifts is because somebody seeds an idea and 5 to 10 years later, it becomes the accepted norm. I got cancelled in my private life about 4 years ago for daring to support Suella Braverman. And this was long before she got anywhere near the cabinet. I mean, and I was just in a very, very low level, level of support. I wasn't advising her, I wasn't anywhere near her in a group. But because myself and my organization at the time came out in support of what was considered far right politics at the time, I lost a job. And so, these things take time. Fast forward a few years' time, and going out for dinner with Suella was the most acceptable thing in the world because she was one of the highest ranking members of government. So, these things take time to shift, even at the what I would call even in mainstream politics. And on the dissident right, which is essentially where everyone was until Reform became actual politicians, all of that infighting takes time to get to the point where it's accepted again. And there are people right now pushing that narrative even further on remigration, on issues like English identity, ethnicity, all this kind of thing. It's funny to me when I see people get called ethnats, because some of them really are, right? They're racist, they're scumbags, and we don't like them. But a lot of them are just the bloke down the pub who doesn't like the fact that his town doesn't look the same anymore and doesn't feel the same, right? And he's not a racist. He's just uncomfortable in his own town. And if you go to Hungary, or you go to Japan, or you go to any of these countries which still have a high level of homogenous ethnicity, the idea that they will be called ethnats in their own country is laughable. Even the left in those countries is an ethnat, if you want to call it that. So certain ideas that get bandied around and pushed to one side for being too extreme, it's all a matter of time before it becomes acceptable.
One last question for you. How dangerous a man do you think Keir Starmer is as a Prime Minister?
Keir Starmer is the most dangerous man, with the exception of Tony Blair, to ever have run Britain. In some ways, he's worse. He's not. He won't get as much done as Blair, so that's a good thing, because he's not very competent. But this is a guy who was in training camps in the USSR. This is a guy who used to spend his summer holidays going out with his communist buddies and learning about why Trotsky was so great. And the people around him are exactly the same. They're student activists who grew up. And we've just seen that hundreds of Labour staffers and SPADs and potentially even MPs are all going out to campaign for Kamala in America. And they're getting an all expenses paid trip. Well, first of all, that's foreign interference in another election. But the left doesn't see it through that paradigm. It's a big, happy SOAS, LSE campus student fair. That's the way they see politics, right? These people are students who just haven't grown up. And Starmer's like that, but with a brain. So if you think about the people who are shutting down the M25 because they want to stop somebody in China or Saudi supplying oil to us, that's the level of thinking these people are at. They're going to use their iPhone while they're sipping on their Starbucks, complaining about capitalism or trying to destroy your liberty. And unless we stand up to them, they're the most dangerous people in the world, because they're not just agents of communism. They're really, really stupid. And the stupid people are the most dangerous. They're more dangerous than any ideology. So if you let Starmer have full tilt for more than a term, this country will be absolutely unrecognizable beyond anything we've ever known. We will have facial recognition technology tracking us left and right. We will have money disappearing from our bank accounts because we were jaywalking. We will have our loved ones being taken away because they posted a meme on Facebook that social services got reported. This is where we're going to be at.
That's already happening. Yeah.
It's already happening, but it's not happening en masse yet. Give them 4 years, it will be happening en masse. There will be people fleeing this country, and there already are, but they will be fleeing en masse, particularly those who have any level of wealth or influence, because we've seen what's happening in Poland as an example right now, when Donald Tusk got in and started destroying their media, arresting people, holding political prisoners. We used to think that it was just Putin that did this kind of thing. Oh, that's not how it works.
Yeah.
With all of these people are demagogues. They're all the dictators waiting to happen. And we'll be next.